There was an intellectual breakthrough that was supposed to happen but didn't. I say this since I've read most of the authors in the science of history. What I've consistently found is that most of said authors were writing around the World War era. Authors like Oswald Spengler, Amaury de Riencourt, Carroll Quigely, Konecki, William McNeill, Arnold Toynbee, amongst others. I don't think we as a society understand how intelligent these people were. On top of this, when you read older books, it's immediately obvious that our society has lost intellectual advancement. We're so addicted to the idea of progress that we can't stomach the idea that we're less intelligent than our ancestors. These thinkers are operating on a level of analysis which you would never see today. For example, Spengler looked at how society's concepts of nature, math, and time can predict its civilizational point in its life cycle, and also what the destiny of said civilization is. These authors ended up getting a lot right. Spengler, Ralph Linton, Amaury de Riencourt, and Carroll Quigely all predicted, writing about a century ago, that the story of the 21st century would be atheism, Caesarism, social alienation, and population collapse. Quigely predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, and Amaury the stagnation of the sciences. With all that being said, these authors all end up sharing a few different points. For one, they all agree that the collapse in religion was a civilization-destroying calamity. Although all authors agree on this point, Carroll Quigely, writing around 1960, especially said that the West's lack of a strong religion, if not solved immediately, would turn to a cancer that would consume every single part of Western civilization. He titled his history of the 20th century Tragedy and Hope, given he hoped the tragedy of the world wars would provoke self-inspection in Western civilization to create the hope of a new religious breakthrough that could save the West in the 21st century. We've since seen, with the rise of a suicidal anti-church to total dominance in the West, that he was correct. The one thing that all these authors agreed on, something which they all made the greatest effort to convey as basically their most important point, is that something unexpected would be the greatest threat to Western civilization. All these authors writing around the World War era agreed that the rise of the bureaucracy was the most dangerous thing to Western civilization, that if left untrammeled, that it would destroy everything that made the West and global civilization great, molding us into a broken tyranny, turning us into everything we hated. Why did they think that? And more horrifyingly, why has it already happened? A huge reason we're facing this crisis is due to the feminization of society, which has reached into every single aspect of life. The masculine is what pushes against bureaucratization, and without the masculine, bureaucracy takes over everything. It's why I'm always looking for ways to revitalize masculinity. However, there is hope, and Black Forest is a good place to start. Black Forest's NMN supplements have been dubbed the feminization killer. NMN is nicotinamide mononucleotide, a derivative of the B vitamin niacin, which works by replenishing diminished NAD+ levels, which naturally fall at a rate of around 1% a year. NMN is known to dramatically improve health and longevity by serving as a precursor to NAD+, a compound that plays a crucial role in energy production, muscle regeneration, metabolism, and gene expression in the body. I actually do use Black Forest in my daily life, and their stuff is really useful, especially when I need to get stuff done. And since they sponsored this video, we have an exclusive offer for you. If you can go to our link in the description or pinned comment, then for the next 48 hours, you can buy 2 and get 1 for free. So stock up now when you still can. In times like this, we need to be vigilant, prepared, and most importantly, we need to take control of our health, because if we don't, they will. So arm yourself with knowledge, stock up on NMN, and let's show them that we won't be silenced or subdued. We're in this together, and together we'll rise above. Part 1. Class analysis. I think we exist in a beautiful moment for dissidents now, given the establishment has failed on almost every level of what a functioning society should expect. This means that for enterprising folks watching, you can choose to provide a service and make good money doing so. Academia has become ideological propaganda, so start writing yourself. The traditional movie industry has failed, so start making your own movies. This is a great point to start with since it illustrates multiple points I'm trying to convey. One of the things I would like to co-opt from the left is class analysis. This is since the left basically invented class analysis and then used it as a vector to win. A huge reason the left dominates society today is that they were able to use 3 different intellectual tricks to manipulate the populace without them even knowing. The left had an intellectual breakthrough in the century from 1850 to 1950, which gave them incredible power. Those 3 thinkers, or at least the ones I can think of now, in that I'm probably missing some more, are Marx, Hegel, and Freud. Read this text wall if you're interested. Marx was able to study class analysis and thus was able to differentiate the population into different sub-interest groups with innate different self-interests. What the left was able to do was to ally itself with certain groups, in our era, women and ethnic or sexual minorities. From this, they were able to pander to their self-interest in order to divide society to win. Is why their platform is their controlled version of diversity, since they've shoved those groups into their coalition, and thus by putting those groups in positions of power for diversity, they can hold on to power very effectively. However, as we'll see in this video, if anyone studied class oppression today, they would see that the left is doing class oppression to a horrifying level. Almost everything the left does today is an attempt by the bureaucracy to gain complete authority over society. Anyone who would study class analysis to the slightest degree would end up finding this. Even left-wing authors like David Graeber. I would like the right to co-opt class analysis for our own benefit. I would like the right to take every single leftist technique, except those that would make us lose our souls, in order to make ourselves better and sharper. For years, I've wanted to make a video studying how different social classes affect the societies they're in. I haven't passed the threshold of intuitive comprehension where I feel comfortable in my own ability to write that video yet, though. However, the best way to explain it is that there are a series of social classes that different societies in history can choose to lead them. Said dominant social class will rework every single element of society in its favor, including its social structure, ruling ideology or religion, economics, social cues, literature, and anything else you could think of. In effect, it permeates the society on such a profound level as to become inextricably linked into its social fabric. Aristotle was able to make a really accurate model of political philosophy nearly 2,500 years ago, which you can read more about in this text wall, since due to the structure of human society, there are only so many ways you can orient a society in game theory terms. For Aristotle, it was either monarchy or rule by one man, oligarchy or rule by a cabal of men, and democracy or all men. A society can be governed by the priest class, the warrior nobility, the merchants, and worst of all, the secret police, just to say a few of the social classes that I've consistently seen lead societies. Each of these is archetypal in that by choosing a certain ruling class, the society takes in traits with similarities to other, often very different societies with the same ruling class. Gaetano Mosca talks a lot about this for those who are interested. A warrior society will have honor as its most important value, will often solve legal disputes through right of combat, or will rule through divine right and have a family-based leadership. A merchant-led society will naturally gravitate towards a parliamentary democracy with strong property rights in a colonial empire. A society run by the secret police will almost always be atheist or agnostic, since religion acts as a brake on the totalitarian extractive power of the secret police, and instead will possibly have a utopian ideology which warrants limitless growth in order to bring about limitless good, which is the only thing that can justify said totalitarianism. Oftentimes, elites are shared on a civilizational basis. China has for thousands of years been run by the bureaucracy, a parallel which we'll study later in this video since it alludes to the current West. Meanwhile, Egypt and India have been run by the priest class. An interesting example for how a society can be molded by a certain ruling class is that when the Portuguese arrived in South India in the early 16th century, there were low-caste kings who weren't weren't allowed to make eye contact with high caste Brahmins who were the subjects of their own country, because the priest class had gained such a social predominance inside India that they weren't subservient even to their own rulers. Greece and India were run by warrior slave nobilities. You often see ruling coalitions, with probably the most normal coalition being between a warrior nobility and a church, as seen in most third world societies or in the Islamic world. The West was the most successful society in history since it had a balance of powers between different ruling classes, whether the nobility, monarchy, merchants, church, or other interests. Secondly, of all the things that made the West great, the most important in my opinion was competition. The Western tradition is predicated upon an objective aim to reach, namely God or the truth, and there's competition for who can best provide that service. This is how science, capitalism, democracy, the Western military system, and Catholicism, or even more so, Protestantism works, in that you establish a structure for domesticated competition in which the best result wins. The West was able to dominate the world in almost every field, whether science, intellectual, health, industry, religion, or war, since the West is comfortable with enough chaos that it's willing to enter into the undiscovered or uncertain to return with goods and glory. Basically, every other society views chaos as a pure evil and is obsessed with order. This is why Asian societies venerate tradition, the government, and patriarchal authority so much. It's also why these societies fossilized, and once the Europeans arrived with rifles and steamships, they were unable to adapt. A healthy society is like water in that it can flow around and adapt to any situation it faces. An example of this working really well, and in my opinion the greatest reason America and Rome became the most successful societies in history, was that their founders established a division of powers, which in turn established the seamless transfers from old corrupt elites to new, more vigorous ones. In America, we've seen the change of the dominant elites going from East Coast merchants to Southern plantation owners to Northern industrialists to coastal managerial class, and now we're forming a new elite around the Gulf of Mexico based off the internet. In Rome, the elite changed from the Etruscan kings to the Roman nobility to the populist bosses, the Roman emperor, the Balkan warlords, then Germanic barbarians, or the Eastern Roman Empire. In each case, a successful society is capable of changing out elites once they become morally corrupt, as all elites naturally do over time as a biological principle. When a civilization goes into decline, it's almost always predominantly driven by a single elite taking over power. This elite then centralizes power and then shuts down progress or growth, since any change would threaten their power. This is why capitalism is so rare over history, since the elite forms an alliance with the mob to tear down the vigorous and successful, since they excite the mob's envy and are a threat to the ruling class. When you study when societies go into decline, you find that it's often a point that's difficult to directly disentangle, and it's an incredibly anticlimactic process. If you want to look at Spain's decline, you would find that there's no single year where Spain stopped being a great power. And this is true of all countries like this, whether Britain or the Muslim world or China, where there is this anticlimactic moment where they shut themselves off to basically the divine creativity that allowed them to form great states, and they become purely mechanical through trying to maintain their current power, which destroys their old creativity. And then in the process of this event that no one noticed happened, these societies lose everything which made them great in the beginning. The ancient Greeks and Romans had advanced machinery and the steam engine, but they never industrialized. Given slave labor was so cheap, there was no push for productivity. Using machinery was seen as ungentlemanly. In effect, a slave-owning ruling class avoided any breakthroughs that could weaken their control over human muscle power. China in the 11th century started an industrial revolution with the largest blast furnaces ever seen until 19th century industrial Britain. In the 15th century, China sailed as far as Kenya and possibly America. In the first case, the ruling bureaucracy created so many regulations that the factories weren't profitable, and in the second case, the bureaucracy burned the treasure fleets after the Yongle emperor died. Islam 1,000 years ago was the wealthiest, most technologically and philosophically advanced, capitalist, humane, feminist, and politically strongest society in the world. However, from that point, the nobility and church teamed up to keep down the merchant classes, peasants, and science. The Middle East went through an active process of social decay and decommercialization. Even before European colonialism, the Middle East regulated itself into obscurity. For just an example, at the time of the Crusades, the Levant was one of the wealthiest places in the world, then descending into complete depopulation by the time the British conquered the region in the early 20th century. Egypt in the 19th century had less than half the people it did in the 12th. All of the authors I mentioned above knew about this historic precedent. This is why they were so terrified about the rise of the bureaucracy. They knew this principle, and before their own very eyes, they saw the rise of the exact sort of social elite which had killed every previous civilization. Now, why did the West go from the society which had done the best job ever at avoiding this to doing it to itself? Part 2. The story of Britain. In 1914, Britain had the largest empire ever seen in global history even today. The insane thing is that the largest empire in history made up less than 5% of Britain's total GDP. The British Empire also made up less than 15% of Britain's foreign trade. This means that Britain conquered the world without ever having to even take up a fraction of their financial efforts. Pre-industrial taxes, with some exceptions, were so low as to barely register today. Britain was the country in Europe with the highest tax rates, and to survive the horrible Napoleonic Wars, they raised their top income tax for the highest income brackets to 10%. Top's tax rate in Britain today is 50% in peacetime. Every single incredible building you see in Washington, D.C., as well as the conquest of modern America from the natives, was done by a society without an income tax. Let's zoom ahead to 1945, or within a single generation of this. The government jumped from making up 5% of Britain's economy to something like 2/3. Today, governments in the Western world make up between half to 2/3 of the economy in peacetime. Top income tax in Britain was 95% and 90% in America. In very short time, the government went from a relatively weak force in Britain and the rest of the Western world to a complete dominating sun. The governments that came out of the world wars, especially even more so behind the Iron Curtain, were the most powerful and intrusive upon personal life known in human history. A theme which we'll tease out in this video is that both sides of the Iron Curtain had much more in common than we'd like to give them credit for. They were both sides of the same coin, being atheist, bureaucratic, leftist technocracies. It's clear that at some point in this process, there was a major shift between different ruling classes. This is the sort of thing that's normal historically, in that the Black Death saw European civilization gradually transfer from a socio-economic system based off feudal nobility to a merchant-based capitalism. Alternately, the Persian conquest of the Near East in the 6th century BC was a warrior nomad elite conquering native regimes like the Babylonians and Egyptians, who were ruled by theocratic priest classes. Britain is an easy example of this. Britain before World War I was a hybrid regime between a warrior nobility, which through a parliamentary system based off income, where they worked with the industrial merchant class, who gradually gained more power as time went on. For a brief side note, an alliance of the nobility and merchants is one of the best combinations a society can have if done well, with some of the most successful societies in history having this combination for reasons I can explain in this text wall. When we look at Britain in 1914, as said before, with their global spanning empire that made up less than 5% of Britain's total GDP, Britain was dependent off a gold standard. They saw inflation as a moral evil. In British law, the government was not allowed to interfere in private family life. Britain did not have conscription until the final year of World War I, relying off high social trust pushing recruitment since they saw a draft as state overreach. The negative side of all of this was the British government was so low government that they didn't intervene in trying to improve the horrible famines in Ireland, which lowered the island's population by 2/3 in the middle of the 19th century, as well as in India, which saw 30 million deaths over the British colonial period, making the famines in British India one of the bloodiest atrocities to ever happen. This is clearly a society which, as I explained in this video, was run by a property-owning merchant class in which the merchants support property rights and parliamentary democracy, which allows the stability for which commerce is necessary. This is also the most effective system in history for economic and social improvement, as I can explain in this text wall. As James Burnham liked to say in his book, which partly inspired this video, ago, or the Managerial Revolution, World War I was the last war of the capitalist order, and World War II the first of the managerial world. For a look at Britain at the end of World War II, it was a country with a 95% tax rate, in which most industries, including even remarkably steel, were nationalized. The British Empire was peacefully decolonized, and as the managers took greater power, even things as ridiculous as what flowers you planted in your garden were regulated by the state. I really can't emphasize how much power the managerial class has and how much it can needle into every single aspect of life. As a petty personal example of this, I used to live in a town that didn't even have an HOA, but the local town would literally fine me if I left my trash can at the curb on any day except the day they picked up the trash. I tested this thesis where I would travel for an extra day, and I would leave my trash can out a day early, and they would always email me every time, even if it was just a single extra day. This stuff is more normal than people think. If we go through every single aspect of a person's life, whether they're work, school, romantic, religious, recreational, child rearing, you'll find a bureaucracy which needles its way in. Even things that you would hopefully imagine would be sacred, like religion, ethnic pride, or sex, or the most culturally and sensually rich things, you'll find a bureaucrat telling you that you're doing it wrong. Britain is a great, and I guess that's not the right word, example of this process reaching a point of sheer ridiculousness. It's insane to see what's going on in Britain. The only way I can explain things is that it's a true nanny state tyranny. It's literally illegal, and you can go to jail in Britain for having offensive memes on your computer, even if you don't share them. Hate speech is still illegal in Britain, even if it's factually true. Keep in mind we have technologies now, due to the internet and the digital revolution, that Orwell never could have dreamed up in his worst nightmares, such as AIs capable of mass surveillance, as well as the little telescreens we keep in our pockets, which know every single detail of our lives. I'm sure to a horrifyingly precise degree that we can't even understand now. Britain is already installing a national surveillance system, and has for decades had cameras in every major public place. Ford Motor Company is installing things that listen to people's conversations in the car to see that what the effectiveness of their advertising campaigns are. Britain is literally having jabs for fat people to lower the cost for the NHS through giving them these injections to lower their weight. That's tyranny, if anything is. The horrible thing is I don't really see a countervening force in Britain in which their conservatives have become completely controlled by a leftist uniparty, which just proves the managerial class domination thesis. When I look at the new Western form of nanny state tyranny, which manifests very strongly in Britain, I see a tyranny so ridiculous, which gains its power by its sheer insanity, which blinds its rivals into a stupor. It's remarkable to watch a meme destroy an entire society. Read this text wall for the multiple meanings of that statement. I'm friends with a lot of British conservatives, and it's horrible to see them live through this. If you folks want to know more, check out the Lotus Eaters podcast, which covers the new insane news coming out of Britain really well. Although, to be frank, I am worried that outlets like this are in danger as the British government careens more towards madness. I have British conservative friends that are leaving the country ASAP since they're afraid for their own safety in somewhere that's becoming a police state. My heart really goes out to Britain, since partly Britain is so culturally close to America that I know that if it can happen in Britain, it can very easily happen here. We also see this exact same process occurring in Australia or Canada, which are as insane, if not more insane than Britain in a lot of ways. Almost all of my ancestry is from the British Isles, and so these are people who are culturally and genetically my kin. Although I find the things they are doing disgusting, it can really happen here. It's also remarkable to me that the British were the people who basically invented freedom. This gets in the way of a lot of racial innate arguments. Lots of authors from a century ago believed that the Saxon and the Celt was a genetically free race, and the events of the last few years have made me question that very deeply. Both of my parents were ethnic nationalists, with my father being very proud of being Irish and my mom being very proud of being English. I guess there's no wonder that they got divorced. And I used to think that British people had some kind of cultural aversion to tyranny, and I see that that's just not not true. And it's horrible to see that my ancestors a century ago were clearing the frontier, and now we've reached the point where after centuries of maintaining this republic, we will throw it away for nothing out of boredom and silliness. One of the interesting parts in James Burnham's book on the managerial class is his predictions of the future. I spend a lot of time studying people in the past predictions of the future, since I also predict the future. Thus, I try to study whatever principles worked in the past. James Burnham was writing around World War II, and much like most of the most advanced rightist thinkers of the last century, was a former communist who took a Marxist class analysis and applied it through a rightist frame. To start, he did get some stuff right. He accurately predicted that the managerial class would be able to seize total control over society. He and Francis, the other author who was really inspirational for this video, were able to clarify the sheer scope of the cultural differences that would come with this, which are difficult for most people to understand. Both really got how the managerial class would break the world in their own interests, largely since Burnham seems to have been a very astute student of the more obvious managerial regimes like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. However, there's one major detail that Burnham got wrong. Burnham predicted that the Western world would become completely communist, with the total loss of private property and the state consuming everything. He said that this was due to the natural self-interest of the managerial class, as I will explain in the next segment. As I read through, I started to wonder why that didn't happen. The best conclusion I could come to is that capitalism is just a superior system holistically to managerial dominance. In fact, what many of the authors mentioned at the start of this video, like McNeil, also did not realize is that when allowed to flow, capitalism will beat the managers. All the authors implicitly assume that managerialism would have the competitive advantage, probably due to it having won in the military-industrial structures of the world wars. Keep in mind the reason that governments took in the managerial revolution was because it was necessary to control the sheer scale of military-industrial economic structures that occurred with the world wars. When we look at the second half of the 20th century, the capitalist structures which survived in America due to its founders establishing a decentralized structure in both national and regional governments were able to cause breakthroughs that would beat the managers. An example of this is the Second World War, the Cold War, and later the Tech Revolution. In each case, the creativity of capitalism was able to defeat the organizational advantage the managers had. This was something I don't fault the authors of the time for not knowing. The Cold War was in many ways an answer to many questions posited in the previous century, as I explained in this text wall. One of the big things that separates us from our very recent ancestors in the 20th century is that they were blinded by the god of progress and reason. And as time has passed and we've lived through the consequences, we've since lost faith in that god, but we have to remember how much it ensnared our ancestors. There are two impulses that came with the godlike power of industrial technology. One was towards freedom and another towards slavery, which are the two normal impulses of massive breakthroughs as we can normally see in frontier cultures between the Cossacks and the serfs of Eastern Europe, or black slavery and the free democracy of North America. What I would like to ultimately say here is that this is not a matter of equality. Once Britain established the managerial class as its rulers, it saw one of the most stunning national collapses ever seen in human history. The British went from the wealthiest, most technologically, culturally strongest nations in the world, with the largest empire ever in history, to a fourth-rate nation. The sun used to never set on the British Empire, but now its people are in poverty. It has nothing worthwhile to export, even culture or intellectual stuff which it used to pride itself on, and which are the normal pride of a declining, once former great empire. Once they took in domination by the managerial class, the British lost everything that mattered to them as a nation. As the founding fathers would say, a man who trades his freedom for security will receive neither in the end. The horrible thing is that even though I used Britain as an example here, this is a consistent pattern across the whole world today. Even places you wouldn't think about like Argentina or Indonesia. If we look at the nations with the worst birth rates, or the second world former communist nations like China, Ukraine, or Russia, is that these are the nations which the bureaucracy had the most control over. These are the oldest nations in the world since they killed their organic cultures, like religion, family, folkways, tradition, honor, so that the people had no reason to live and thus procreate. They're also not rich enough to even cover comfortable national retirements like the Germans or the Japanese. Now let's look at Europe, which is a parallel to Britain. Europe went from the most advanced place in the world technologically, culturally, philosophically, militarily, economically, and being a dynamo which dominated the whole planet, with nearly the whole world either being a European colony or one step removed from it. Europe has now become a museum, crashing from 40% of the world's economy in 1968 to 19% now. Surprisingly, none of those trends occurred in America, which has remarkably stayed a constant percent of the world economy since the 60s, taking in Europe's former predominance in all of those fields. When we look at the growth in the world right now, it's an almost perfect match for the weakness of the managerial class, in that growth either happens in places like Texas or Dubai that purposely allow the free market, or in poor third world countries that aren't wealthy enough to afford bureaucracies yet. Part 3. Managerial incentives. I spoke earlier about how certain ruling classes have archetypal incentives which you see over their different manifestations. What that means is we can look to other societies in which the bureaucracy won to see what they did afterwards. There are a few examples before in history that we can look to. In general, once an empire gets beyond a certain size, it needs a bureaucracy by definition to manage its sheer scope anywhere in history. The question beyond this is how much power the bureaucracy gets, and can it transplant other ruling classes, which rarely happens. In most cases, the military is able to get a stranglehold on power due to them having the guns to bully the bureaucrats. Examples of this were 19th century France, the Ottoman Turks, the Roman Empire, Tsarist Russia, the Arab Caliphate, amongst others. The only cases where this doesn't happen is in situations in which the external military threats aren't enough for the military to be strong enough to bully the bureaucracy. For an example of a strange dynamic like this, and a good place to talk about the first time in Western history the bureaucracy gained any real power, is the French Revolution. I've been on a big French Revolution research rabbit hole lately. Taking from Toqueville, whose book on this is unbelievably good, I now view the French Revolution as a series of class wars for control over France. Pre-revolutionary France was paradoxically an absolutist monarchy which existed to protect a free society, in that the King of France was literally given absolute power for the purpose of maintaining French people's freedoms. France had a combination of different social elites which competed for power between the church, nobility, monarchy, merchants, and bureaucracy. The bureaucracy had been grown to express the monarch's will. One of the most brilliant points that Toqueville touches on is that within 2 years of the establishment of a bureaucratic committee whose role was to manage the whole French kingdom, or paralleled to the king, the French Revolution took place. The point here is that the French Revolution was when the bureaucracy, which the king used to realize his own power, themselves realized they didn't need the king and the nobility, so they killed them. The bureaucracy went a step further and then also tried to replace the church and merchant class, as well as colonize the military with their own supporters. This is why the French Revolution failed, since the bureaucracy was still fundamentally dependent on an authoritarian king to lead them. Without that, they spiraled into crabs in the bucket and envious purges. What then happened is that with Napoleon, the military became the new king in French society, which continued over the 19th century until the bureaucracy could gain total dominance over France after the horrors of World War I. There's a handful of points I want to unpack here. The first is that the bureaucracy will always push for authoritarianism first, and then totalitarianism by its very design, unless, like China, there's an explicit religious and social structure built against it. Humans can only really organize through hierarchy or emergent phenomena. This is why you either see slavery or serfdom or capitalism over history. When the communists tried to replace capitalism, they had to default onto slavery, since that's the only real alternative. The bureaucracy, since it's against emergent living phenomena, turns the world into controlled matter which they can manipulate, thus requiring authoritarian governance. When we look at the great democratic free societies over history, like Britain, America, the Dutch, Athenians, or Romans, when they were their freest and strongest, these were societies which had a near complete absence of bureaucracies. They were governed through a combination of the free market, a strong religion providing social trust, and a nobility with a strong sense of social obligation. The bureaucracy exists to make sure stuff gets done in the absence of those other social institutions. This is why Hayek said the natural endpoint of the state's intervention into the economy was the road to serfdom, something which we've seen in the real world, as in 1920, 90% of Americans were self-employed or worked in small businesses, and in 1990, 90% were employees. Thus, bureaucracy was strong enough that France could not be a real democracy until it industrialized when the private market got strong enough. Democracy stems from the power of the merchant class or a proud warrior nobility, which are often the same thing, as I explained in this text wall. Secondly, the bureaucracy will naturally push for totalitarianism, given the bureaucracy's natural incentive. And remember, things follow their incentive without thinking or even often being able to help themselves, is towards perpetual growth. This is something Sam Francis explained really brilliantly. What has happened, and we see this very clearly through the French Revolution, is that the bureaucracy made a religion in which they were God, and the infinite growth of the bureaucracy was the morally necessary and correct path to choose. We often think of liberalism as synonymous with leftist, but the reality, which I explain in these two videos, and this is why the word liberal is so complex and contradictory, is that liberalism is actually two ideologies masquerading as the same thing. This is what Sam Francis called classical liberalism versus consensus liberalism. The difference is very much masculine versus feminine, or merchant class versus bureaucracy. Classical liberalism stems from Locke and the British Enlightenment, culminating in the American Revolution. Consensus liberalism stems from Rousseau and leads to the French Revolution. Both of them cluster around the idea of personal freedom and abstract but not reality. Classical liberalism is freedom from authority, and consensus liberalism is freedom from responsibility. Classical liberalism sees personal freedom as extending from God as the ultimate arbiter of political theory. Consensus liberalism stems from Rousseau's idea that the will of the people, or emotions, are the ultimate political arbiter. Classical liberals see the freedom as the government not being able to interfere in your life. Consensus liberals that the government supports you financially, allows you to get abortions, or stops discrimination, making sure things are fair. Protection from the government to protection by the government. Let me be clear that classical liberals are the objectively accurate definition of freedom and of the term liberal. Terms are completely screwed today, as the left purposely obfuscates this stuff as a literal strategy that they admit to. However, the right-left division is this divide inside liberalism, in which the classical liberals have a tendency to work with nationalists and religious interests, while the consensus liberals with Marxists and their descendants. We see this in the French Revolution, in which the leftist factions then basically matched the leftist coalition today, ranging from people who are close to classical liberals to literal communists. As the French Revolution went on for years, the classical liberals gradually lost out authority to people who were literal socialists. What the left's coalition has in common is that they see bureaucratic bloat as the ultimate religious aim of the human race. I explain this more so in this video. However, the left sees progress, which coincidentally is only progress if carried out by the bureaucracy, as the only aim of life that's worthwhile. When progress occurs under capitalism, it doesn't count, and when communism fails, it also doesn't count. Having a communist state without a bureaucracy is physically impossible, and that's really the point. One of the points Sam Francis has made is that the left's strategy is picking issues that physically can't be solved by a bureaucracy, and thus allowing infinite bureaucratic bloat. The issues with ethnic ghettos, the hysteria of Karens, the innate biological differences between classes, races, and sexes, inequality, hierarchy, empire, war, struggle, a sense of self, tradition, and the nation itself. It's important to see the left as the bureaucracy declaring war on all human and even non-human life, trying to rupture and control it all. You can give the left all they could ever want and more, as we have already done in our society, and as we see, they'll demand even more, given the bureaucracy demands infinite bloat. As it grows, the bureaucracy must grow ever bigger, like the Midgard serpent eating its own tail. From this perspective, the left sounds completely insane, and it is. However, the reason they were able to even think of this is that the 20th century involved giving the state complete power over almost all aspects of human life. Literal electricity, water, and food alongside work, media, and education. This is the power the god emperors of Egypt and Peru would have killed for. Thus, we made the state our god, and the extension of its power was our religion. The first country in Europe to develop a strong, centralized bureaucratic state was France, and thus that's where leftism first started with the French Revolution. revolution. I don't think people realize how much power we've already given unelected bureaucratic officials, with the executive branch or the FBI and CIA as good examples. Again, these are people the public never consented to, but unelected officials appointed them. Now they control almost every element of human life, between economics, between who the state spies on, between foreign relations, even stuff that's romantic or personal life or the family. The bureaucracy has unelected almost infinite power over. This is why the American Revolution worked and the French fell into insane despotism almost immediately, even though they were both liberal. The American Revolution existed with clear boundaries established by the merchant classes and the South's slave-owning nobility, that in order to maintain freedom, you had to separate power. In the French Revolution, the bureaucracy declared war on human life and society, which failed, as it has to. De Tocqueville said something so beautiful here, that so many in the ruling regime of France during the Revolution said they loved mankind or the nation in abstract, and yet you could see them do the worst things to the people around. Who is the abstract nation of people they love if everyone they actually deal with as an individual they give suffering? The left created a false simulacrum or imitation of the world, in which the growth of the bureaucracy was ordained by their god of dialectical progress. I hope you see from this how the story of the last 200 years has in large part been the growth of the bureaucracy over Western civilization. This isn't just leftism, in which fascism is just as much a managerial ideology. The Industrial Revolution and centralization of government demanded management in order to keep the sheer scale of things cooperating. A majority urban society demands bureaucracy since humans did not evolve to cooperate on this scale, and thus you need paperwork to fill the evolutionary gap. Another example posited by the French Revolution is that it's impossible to hold the bureaucracy accountable. I talk about this more in the communism video, in which the way communism works by nature is that no one can ever be held accountable for anything. This is a bigger detail than it sounds, since it means nothing can be accomplished and you can't have any standards. Let's say you run a company or a school and you can't fire bad employees. You would stop accomplishing anything. The irony, something that Orrin McIntyre touches on very well with his book The Total State, another very good source on this topic, is that the bureaucracy in the modern world was established as a check on the worst, most animalistic parts of human nature. The irony is that it just enables its worst evils. This is since the bureaucracy can't be held responsible for any of its actions, and it has no standards to assess itself against. This is why the worst atrocities in history, such as the Holocaust, the Great Leap Forward, the Holodomor, Qin Shi Huangdi's tyranny, and Caligula, were all carried out by the bureaucracy. Bureaucracies exist as a tool to wield power. That's their purpose. They are established inside structures since they're very good at either extending the reach of power or its duration. The problem with that is that they become addicted to power, much like the One Ring to rule them all. The worst part of the bureaucracy is its complete inhumanity, and that besides the secret police, which is another form of bureaucracy, is that it's the least human and living of all the ruling classes. This is the origin of Hannah Arendt's theories on the banality of evil, in which she studied the Holocaust and found that the humans who perpetuated it were all pretty boring people. The logic here is that the bureaucracy can perpetuate the worst evils under the guise of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that that which does the most good for most people is the best. The problem with this logic is that it leaves out context, and so without other belief structures, utilitarianism can be used to justify the most horrifying evils. A majority of wolves voting to eat the minority of sheep. Modernity thinks evil has to be some Genghis Khan burning cities down, but no, it can be very ordinary and very boring. We've said many negative things about the bureaucracy so far, but as a counterpoint, let's look to a society where the bureaucracy has both done the best and also in which it was able to maintain its power stably for thousands of years. The only major pre-industrial society I can think of in which the bureaucracy gained total social authority was China. Interestingly enough, the French revolutionaries were obsessed with China, and Rousseau's idea of the social contract stems from the ancient Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven. China was run by a ruling class called the Mandarins. The language Mandarin, or the dominant Chinese language today, stems from the dialect they spoke in the Middle Ages. The Mandarins took over China gradually 2,000 years ago under the Han Dynasty. China's ruling class was chosen by having young men take a test. Whoever scored highest on said test would then be given government government positions, which they could then financially loot for their own gain. Families would invest for generations in hope that their children would get said government jobs in order to repay their investment. The bureaucracy suppressed China's capitalism, and wealthy merchants would in turn buy land and try to get their children government positions as soon as they could. To start, there were negatives with China's bureaucrat ruling class, which we alluded to at the start of this video. For most of history, China was the wealthiest and most technologically advanced society in the world, and they invented the printing press, gunpowder, and the compass. However, China stagnated for centuries, never using any of the technology, having colonies, or adopting ideas from the West. When the British sent a delegation to China in 1791 with technology 500 years more advanced than anything China had, the Chinese said the British had nothing to offer them of any interest. China nearly had an industrial revolution. They sent ships out as far as Kenya, and they possibly reached America, while each time the bureaucracy actively shut them down, either by regulating the factories in the 11th century or burning the treasure fleets in the 15th. China has spent a majority of the last 1,000 years governed by barbarian conquerors who the Chinese have normally outnumbered 100 to 1, since the bureaucracy purposely starved the Chinese military of talent and funding, knowing that if it gains enough power, it would supplant the bureaucracy. If you want to know more, watch the video I made on Chinese civilization. However, even with all of this, in the pre-modern world, you could very convincingly argue that China was the most successful civilization in human history ever. China was consistently the most populous, united, technologically advanced, wealthiest, civilized state for much of the pre-modern world. China clearly worked as a society while having a bureaucracy, so what about China's bureaucratic system allowed them to maintain said stable society while the bureaucracy in modern history has largely been cancerous? Part of the answer is that China's religion, Confucianism, had pre-established protections against the predatory elements in the bureaucracy. Said bureaucracy was beholden to tradition and forced to study the classics as the predominant selection measure. This would be as if America selected its ruling class through Bible study, which ends up with a very different demographic than the current bureaucracy. This also prevents them from using the religion of progress to demand continuous growth forever. China's bureaucracy had made their peace with the universe, not declaring war on life. Confucianism very much prioritizes reciprocal relations, which created inbuilt measures against predating on the population too horrifically. Secondly, China's bureaucrat nobility were predominantly landowners. They were rural people who owned land and then used the revenue from said lands to invest in educating their children so that they could pass the tests. This created a connection to both the earth and the people missing from our current bureaucracy, who exists as a separate caste from the population. This all reminds me of how the West, for the first time since World War II, became an elite based off test taking. I find this interesting since it's an enormous cultural difference versus the old elite, which stemmed either from being businessmen or being part of the nobility. On top of this, it backfired very quickly in that college has already within a lifetime failed as a selection tool for a future ruling class. The West briefly tried the Chinese system and rejected it nearly immediately. Part 4. The future. If you were to ask me what the future of the bureaucracy in the West is, I largely think they've doomed themselves, in America at least. To explain why, I will use 3 words, those being internet, artificial intelligence, and wokeness. For the first two, we were dependent upon the bureaucracy in an industrialized civilization in which you had to coordinate lots of people at once. The internet and AI immediately crush both of those. The internet allows asynchronous, emergent cooperation. AI could replace all the managerial jobs overnight now. We don't need the bureaucracy anymore. For the third, the West's experiment with bureaucracy recently has been so cursed, I think they're going to end up overstaying their welcome. Communism and fascism, two sides of the managerial coin, killed 150 million people combined, or by far the bloodiest event in history. An interesting thing my friend Samo Berja once said is that the World Economic Forum is an attempt to automate population collapse, in that the world's population needs to collapse by at least half by the end of this century. The bureaucracy saw this, and as the bureaucracies do, thought that they should make a system out of it, which they call degrowth. Degrowth is so incredibly dystopian that I could have never even guessed it would have existed 10 years ago. And the reason it's so insane is it's taking something that should never be turned into a system and making it a bureaucracy. It's something only our society would be so simultaneously both stupid and intelligent enough to do. Imagine if the Romans had a government agency called "Let's import the Goths, shrink the economy, make the peasants poor, and destroy the currency," and that was what their ideology told them to do. The problem is the bureaucracy is doing all of that stuff now, and they're telling us that it's good. The bureaucracy never deals with living people, and thus their ability to understand others is ridiculously poor. This is why they produce content which just looks completely ridiculous, and they should know must horribly backfire. Examples include the recent Guys for Kamala, Stephen Colbert's vaccine dance, or the Velcro video. If you haven't watched it, watch all of those. They're comedy gold. Any normal person would know that a normal person would take these as basically an insult. This is why they're shocked people are angry that they are actively trying to drive their nations and everything they love extinct. Keep in mind, studies have consistently found conservatives can understand how leftists think, but leftists cannot understand how conservatives think at all. Keep in mind, our managerial elite purposely never cross-references their theories against actual humans. For example, our social sciences make using history to understand the world taboo. I made this video on this topic for those who are interested. What this means is that our plans for how we govern ourselves are basically built off complete delusional fantasies, not grounded in anything real. As I said before, the left has declared war on human life. Secondly, the bureaucracy established a world so sterile and dead that no one can have kids. Only a bureaucrat could think up a concept like the current concept of consent. If a woman is naked in your bed of her own volition, that's consent, not filling out a form before she comes home to your place. Part of the reason that our birth rate is collapsing so hard, and so many young people say it's immoral to have children, is since we live in a world that's so sterile and anti-human that the bureaucracy didn't build it for people, but for cogs. As the new age starts, we need to make an active effort to build a society based around the crazy monkeys we are, not around some bureaucrats' delusions of completely breaking life for the DMV employees.